So this is Straight Talk 30. We're going to be talking about what the prediction of mortgage rates, and also how to handle repairs when you're in escrow that won't botch things up with a mortgage. So we'll start with mortgage rates, and I'll tell you, I've probably done about I've done several hours of research on this and read probably 30 different opinions from experts. And to be honest with you, they're all over the board of what rates are going to do. About 45% of the experts think that mortgage rates are going to increase, 36% think that they're going to stay stagnant, and 18% think that they're going to go down. But the general consensus of what I'm reading is, and I've checked with a few bank owners as well, and they have the same opinion, that if you've heard, there's been a slight increase over the last few weeks. So they hit a drop dead low point in December, but over the last couple of weeks, they've actually inched up about 0.2, which isn't huge. We're still in the twos, but the experts are saying that for the first half of this year, rates are going to steadily increase a smidge, like very small, but it seems like we've hit our low point. So if you have clients that are kind of teetering, like, oh, should I buy now? Should I? If you're going to do something, now is the time to get the still closest to the lowest rates. After this, at the second half of this year, because vaccines will be coming out, because it will open up new, businesses will reopen, jobs will, people will be hired because the business will be open. It's going to stimulate the economy, which actually ends up being bad for mortgage rates. So towards the end of this year, they're going to be on a higher rise. They're still going to stay lower, but they predict it's going to be about a 1% increase over the next year to a year and a half, just because of all those factors. One thing that I thought was interesting is right now the average rate is 2.75. If they think that it'll go up about 1%, then on an average of $300,000 loan amount, that increases a consumer's payment about $170 a month, which over the term is about $60,000 in additional finance charges. So use that data to talk with your clients who are on the fence to say, okay, you're going to buy a now times pricing and save about $60,000 over the term. Now's the time to pull the trigger, kind of thing. And then I got a question before of how does the election impact rates? There was a ton I read, but simply with the Democrats being now 50-50 Senate voting ability, with Vice President being able to do the tiebreaker, means that it's good for Democrats, but there's a lot, they're predicting that we're going to be spending a lot more money and giving stimulus money. And when they do that, that hurts mortgage rates as well. So that's kind of generally it in a nutshell of what I had prepared to talk through. I don't know if anybody has any questions on that before we go on to the repair subject. Nope. Was I? That's it? No? Nobody? Okay. Cody's going to help me talk through the repair subject. What I wanted to say is what we've seen on purchase contracts that have come over that kind of put a wrench in with underwriting is when agents identify that actual repairs are going on and that the seller is contributing X amount towards repairs. When addendums are written up that way, the underwriter then says what repairs are needed. It's like opening Pandora's box. Then the underwriter wants to know, what are the repairs? We need an inspector to go out there to confirm that those repairs are done. A nice, clean, easy way to handle the repairs if there's minimal things to be done is to say seller to give X amount in buyer closing cost contribution. Buyer is purchasing the home as is. Now, one thing that happens is if they're more extensive in repairs, like an AC unit or something huge, just to be prepared to know that, and if it's an AC unit that needs to be done, underwriting is going to need a receipt, confirmation that it's in, and the inspector to go out and say, yes, it's all in, up to code. It just creates a little bit more layers of what, what kind of inspections need to be done. Cody, do you have anything to say about, what you've seen and what the best way is to handle that, to kind of get through the, seller and buyer personalities there?
Yeah, so I have a couple of things on this subject that I'm pretty passionate about and are part of my CE class that I teach called Seller Beware that I can share here in a minute. But from a realtor's perspective, what you're just describing there, Kari, the way that should be handled in the paperwork is that the request for repairs form can say, hey, these are the requests that the buyer is requesting. The seller's response on that same form can say, the seller agrees to give a credit of $1,000 or whatever in lieu of repairs, but don't send the request for repairs into the lender. Do a separate addendum that says what Kari just said. Seller to credit buyer $1,000 towards buyer's closing cost. And Kari always adds buyer is purchasing the home as is or something like that. I never even put that on there. I don't even want to mention anything about the condition of the property. I just do an addendum that says the seller is crediting the buyer's closing costs by $1,000. And that way the underwriters don't have to get spooked that there's $1,000 worth of terrible repairs that need to be done in the house. And the underwriter just sees that it's part of the contract that the seller agreed to give a credit. It works much easier that way.
I've had it where sellers then say, well, how do we know that this $1,000 is going to take care of the repairs? Like, I want that in writing. Well, that's why we added the second sentence, so that it kind of appeased the seller, because sometimes we were getting pushback on, they want to make sure that this is isolated to that repair and that buyer isn't going to come back and say, oh no, that $1,000 was just going towards closing costs. You still have to take care of repairs.
I mean, I've never personally run into that because we have a separate form called the request for repairs form, where that is all very spelled out and it's dictated very clearly. So as long as that form is done correctly, then an addendum that changes the credit that a seller is giving, to me, that's sufficient. But it doesn't hurt to say the seller or the buyer is buying the property as is. That's fine. I just have always handled it the way I would handle any other credit, because there's lots of reasons that a seller could agree to credit the buyer. Repairs is not the only reason. And so I just leave that out because it's nobody else's freaking business what they're doing it for. It's just informing everybody else in the addendum, this is what we're doing. So, I mean, if you're doing it instead of a request for repairs, then yeah, you'd probably need to say something very clearly about the condition of the property. But we always handle it, I do for my transactions, with that request for repairs form, and find that to be more efficient.
That makes sense. Then maybe that's when it's come up, is when they didn't fill out that repairs form and they just wanted to specifically make sure it was, that covered everybody's bases because they didn't have a backup or something.
Yeah, and I think either way is fine. I was just sharing the way I've always done it.
Okay. What about the bigger repairs, like the AC unit and like repair for a pool, and where it's, how do you address those with, because it's gonna spook the lender no matter what, if you have kind of if you put that type of repair on.
Well, if there's a repair that the seller is going to do and pay for prior to the close of escrow, we don't document that in a separate addendum anywhere. The request for repairs will say the buyer's requesting this be done. The seller agrees to do that before the close of escrow and does it, and doesn't, we don't tell the lender about that. We just do it and get it to the right status. If there's a huge repair that let's say like a $5,000 repair, and the buyer agrees to just take a $5,000 credit instead of doing the repair, it's most likely going to be something that we can't do it that way, because either the appraisal will condition for it or the lender will condition for it, and it must be done prior to the close of escrow. So the scenario you're bringing up doesn't really happen very often in my experience. And if it does happen, it has to get done prior to, and we just handle it using the request for repairs form.
Okay.
Can I share my screen for a minute?
Please.
There you go.
Okay. This is a question. This is a question that is on a little like pop quiz I do at the beginning of my CE class called Seller Beware, and the question has to do with what kinds of repairs are appropriate for a buyer to ask a seller for. And so what it says is, regarding the buyer's request for repairs, it's appropriate for the buyer to ask the seller to repair, and then there's A, B, C, D, or E. A is items of a general maintenance or cosmetic nature. B, items which are identified by the inspection report, regardless of how much or little they affect the property's value. C, items the buyers noticed they wanted fixed when they initially viewed the property. D, all of the above, and E, none of the above. And in my classes, the vast majority of people choose D, all of the above. They say, well, it's appropriate for the buyer to ask for any of those, whether they're cosmetic, if they're identified in the inspection, or if they noticed that they wanted them fixed when they were walking through the property. The interesting thing is that this is what the RPA says about that. So this is section 7F, buyer's request for repairs. And it says right here, the buyer reserves the right to request repairs based on the seller's SRPD or items which materially affect value or use of the property, revealed by an inspection, certification, or appraisal. Items of a general maintenance or cosmetic nature which do not materially affect value or use of the property, which existed at the time of acceptance, and which are not expressly addressed in this agreement, are deemed accepted by the buyer. So what I see in my career, let me stop sharing here now. So anyway, in my opinion, the answer to the question, to this quiz question, is not all of the above, it's none of the above. Because we just got done reading that the RPA says that it's none of the above. And what I see happening in my career, what I've seen happening is if a listing agent has reviewed this section of the agreement with the seller, like the listing agent should, then the buyer might ask for things that the seller is not expecting the buyer to be asking for. And so you have this misalignment of expectations. My opinion is that buyers and sellers agents alike should be reviewing the RPA section 7 with the client and making sure that the expectations of the clients are what they should be. Because there are a lot of clients that are coming from out of state where you just get an inspection report, you just send the report over to the seller, and it's expected that the seller will just fix every little thing that's mentioned in the inspection report. And that's just not really how we do it here. And so if the buyer has that expectation, the time to address that with the buyer is in the beginning. If you wait till you have a home inspection to have that conversation with the buyer, then the buyer is going to feel like you just have commission breath and you're just trying to press these things on them and force them to close, not force them to, but persuade them to close without those repairs getting done. But if you've had that conversation up front that, hey, listen, we need to price this into our offer, if there's stuff like that that you've seen, because this is what your offer says. And as a listing agent, I have a few times said to a buyer's agent, hey, my seller is pushing back really hard on your request for repairs because their expectations are that your buyer's agreeing to what they agreed to in the offer they sent over. And it sometimes is deer in the headlights for buyer's agents. They're like, well, what do you mean? What are you talking about? And they don't even know that this is part of the agreement that says already in advance what kinds of repairs should be expected from the parties. So this is one of the things that I think is like really misunderstood by by realtors in general, that I think if we understood better and handled it differently with clients, would cause a whole lot less contention in transactions and would make our transactions close a lot smoother. I've seen when I do this with buyers and sellers alike, it goes better. And one more tip I'll give as a listing agent, when you get an offer from a buyer, sometimes if you've taken my seller beware class, you know that my discussion with the seller when they're getting ready to sign an RPA is quite thorough. And I do it in a way that really makes a lot of problems that usually come up in transactions be handled right from the beginning so that they just don't come up. But one of the things I'll do is I'll call a buyer's agent and say, let me just use an example here. Pam, you've submitted an offer for your buyer. And I'll say, hey, Pam, my seller's inclined to accept your buyer's offer. I just wanted to check on something first. We have reviewed section 7 of the RPA pretty thoroughly. And we've reviewed the paragraph that talks about repairs, and it's on page blah, 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 line blah, blah, blah. And that's what my seller is expecting. So would you please, before you do your inspection, have that discussion with the buyer so that the buyer also is aware of what the seller is expecting. And if you already know that your offer is expecting to ask for a bunch of things that you maybe should be baking into the offer, maybe we should be discussing what your offer looks like to begin with so that those things are handled in advance. Those little conversations between the agents to help manage expectations amongst the agents and the clients, I have found go a long, long ways. And one of the things that I kind of pride myself on is that most of my transactions don't cancel. If I go into escrow, they almost always close. Sorry, they almost always close. And the reason is because I make sure that before we go into escrow, all the little sticking points like this are taken care of. And it greases the skids and the transactions happen easier. The clients like each other, the agents like each other, and there's so many things that can be avoided. This is one of the things that I think really we could do better as realtors in doing.
Yeah, I've always known you as being proactive on what you know is going to happen and just having those conversations up front, because it's like you are absolutely paving the way. And there's no surprises. There's nothing worse than people getting surprised. That's when people get frustrated, and that's when you have fights happen or arguments happen or stuff that you shouldn't even have to argue over.
Well, see, the thing that we forget is, as professionals in this business, is that we already know what the rest of the pathway looks like all the way through the close of escrow and even beyond the close of escrow. We know what that's going to be for the client, but the clients usually don't know. So if you're not talking to them about what's coming down the pathway, then when those things come, they're surprised. So another example of this is when I do a listing appointment, while we're signing the listing agreement, I tell people about the fact that they're going to have to pay for an HOA resale package up front. And the reason I do that is because if I don't tell them that, when it comes time for them to pay, it's like a 20-minute conversation about what it is and why they've got to do it. And it just is, it's just a clunky part of the process. But if while I'm doing the listing appointment with them, I let them know right from the beginning what it is and what it's for. Then when they get the email from my TC saying, hey, you got to order your resale package, they just do it. And so there's just a few things like this that I've noticed really help. But the reason I'm bringing this up, the one about the repairs up, is because that's today's topic. And it's very mismanaged by realtors. It's part of the reason we're ranked so low on the continuum of respectable professions out there by our clients, because we do a bad job at it, and we should do better as a group at that. And since that's what it says in the RPA, that's what the buyer is offering. So if the buyer comes along later with a big request for repairs that's inconsistent with what they suggested in the beginning, it makes sense that the seller could feel a little bit of frustration on this. And I really think the onus is on the buyer's agent to explain this to their buyers in the beginning. And if you do, it's extremely helpful. And it also does those two things that I always mention that turn a client or turn a lead into a client. It helps you understand what makes them tick, and it gives them confidence in your competence. And those two things are something I'm working on all the time with my clients.
Thanks for being on, Cody. Thanks for giving your commentary and your advice. And I hope my interest rate part made sense. Essentially, they're going up. They're going to slightly go up slowly, but by the end of the year, they predict about 1% higher. So anyway, everybody have a great weekend. Thanks for coming on.
Bye. Thank you. Good stuff.
Bye, Ursula. Good to see you.